My name is Jasmine and I'm 18 years old. My birthday was supposed to be a celebration, the one day my stepfather Gary might finally acknowledge I existed. Instead, it was the day he tried to buy my disappearance. I walked into the foyer of our Savannah home, the air heavy with humidity and hostility, and Gary was waiting. He didn't have a cake. He didn't have a card. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. He didn't hand it to me, he flicked it at me like I was a beggar on the street. It fluttered to the floor between us. "Get out," he said, his voice flat and final. "I'm done paying for another man's mistake. You're 18. You're legal. You're gone." He thought that $100 bill was an insult. He thought it was the period at the end of a long, painful sentence. But he was wrong. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I bent down, picked up the bill and smiled. Then I reached into my bag and pulled out a sealed manila envelope I'd been keeping safe for 2 years. "I know," I said, my voice steady. "And my real father is waiting outside." Gary frowned, confused. I pointed out the front window to the curb where a midnight blue Bentley was idling, its engine purring softly. The rear window rolled down, revealing the face of Jonathan Sterling, the global shipping tycoon Gary had spent his entire career trying to impress. Gary's face went gray. He looked from the car to the DNA results in my hand, and for the first time in my life I saw fear in his eyes. Before we see Gary's face crumble when he realizes who is in that car, drop a comment. If you were kicked out at 18, who is the first person you would call? I want to know who has your back. I slid into the back seat of the Bentley, the heavy door sealing with a solid, expensive thud that shut out the humid Savannah air. The silence inside was instant and absolute. It smelled like aged leather and the faint, clean scent of cedar, a stark contrast to the stale cigar smoke and aggressive perfume that permeated the house I had just left. As the car pulled away from the curb, I didn't look back at Gary standing in the driveway. I looked at the house itself. From the outside, it was a pristine colonial estate, the picture of Southern respectability. But inside, it was a crime scene where my childhood had been systematically dismantled for 10 years. I met Gary when I was 8. My mother had just died, leaving me with a grief so heavy I could barely breathe, and a life insurance policy she had sworn would keep me safe. Gary married my stepmother, Tiffany, 6 months later, and he didn't just move into our lives, he consumed them. He liked to tell the neighbors he had taken in a charity case, but behind closed doors, I was a servant who had to pay for her own room and board. The financial abuse started small. When I was 12, I started babysitting for the neighbors. I made $40 a weekend. Gary demanded $30 of it for rent. He called it teaching me responsibility. He said I needed to learn the value of a dollar. But the lesson wasn't about responsibility. It was about power. I would hand over my crumpled bills, watching his eyes light up with that petty, greedy shine, and then I would walk past the living room and see my stepbrother, Cole, unboxing a new gaming console that cost $500. Cole got tutors for classes he failed. I got lectured for needing new shoes. Cole got brand new dirt bikes. I got told I was eating too much. People always ask why I didn't leave sooner. They look at situations like mine and wonder why the victim stays, why they endure the humiliation year after year. They call it weakness. Psychologists call it learned helplessness. The idea that after enough punishment, you stop believing you can escape the cage even when the door is open. But that wasn't my reality. I wasn't helpless. I was strategic. I knew that running away at 15 would only end with the police dragging me back to a man who would punish me twice as hard. I knew that fighting back without leverage would only get me crushed. So I accepted the invisible chains. I let Gary believe he had broken me. I let him think my silence was submission. But it wasn't submission. It was observation. I was biding my time, waiting for the clock to run out, waiting for the day the law said I was free. I looked down at the book in my lap. To anyone else, it looked like a battered copy of Great Expectations, a boring classic from a high school reading list. But it was a fake. I had hollowed it out years ago with an X-Acto knife. Inside, wrapped in a velvet cloth, was an antique brass compass my mother had given me before she passed. But the compass wasn't the most valuable thing in there. Tucked underneath it was a small black ledger. For 4 years, every time Gary demanded money, every time he refused to pay for a school trip while buying Tiffany diamond earrings, every time he lied about where the money went, I wrote it down. I kept the receipts. I tracked the dates. Gary thought he was erasing me, but he was just giving me the evidence I needed to destroy him. Jonathan's estate was less of a house and more of a compound, a sprawling masterclass in old money architecture set deep within a grove of ancient live oaks. We sat in his study, a room lined with mahogany bookshelves and smelling of beeswax and expensive scotch. He placed a black credit card on the desk between us. "For whatever you need," he said. "Clothes, a car, tuition. You don't have to worry about money ever again, Jasmine." I looked at the card. It represented everything Gary had ever denied me: security, freedom, ease. But I didn't reach for it. I pushed it back across the polished wood. "I don't want your money, Jonathan. I can pay my own way. What I need is your legal team." He looked surprised, then impressed. "You want to sue him?" "No," I said, pulling the black ledger from my bag and opening it to a page I had bookmarked with a paperclip. "I want to audit him." I pointed to an entry dated 6 months ago. May 12th. I needed $600 for a logistics certification exam. It was the final step to getting a specialized license that would have let me work at the port for real wages, not minimum wage. Gary told me the family was strapped for cash. He gave me a lecture on austerity. 2 days later, on May 14th, he bought a brand new trolling motor for his fishing boat. Cost $1,200. He didn't just deny me money. He denied me a future because he wanted a toy. Jonathan picked up the ledger. His eyes scanned the pages, his expression darkening with every line. He saw the entries for school trips I missed, the medical appointments canceled because they were too expensive, the clothes I bought from thrift stores while Tiffany paraded around in designer boutiques. "He stole your childhood in installments," Jonathan said, his voice low and dangerous. "He nickeled and dimed you out of a life." "He thinks he got away with it," I replied. "He thinks because the amounts were small no one would notice. But I noticed. And now I have the math to prove it." My phone buzzed against the hardwood desk, vibrating with a violence that made us both jump. The screen lit up with a name I hadn't deleted yet: Gary. I picked it up. I expected a groveling apology, maybe a plea for forgiveness now that he knew who my father was. I should have known better. Narcissists don't apologize, they attack. The text was a paragraph long, a wall of gray bubbles. "You think you're clever pulling a stunt like that? You're ungrateful trash. You sign a waiver releasing any claim to this house immediately, or I will make sure everyone in Savannah knows about your history of mental instability and lying. I will ruin your reputation before you even start. Don't test me." I handed the phone to Jonathan. He read it and the muscle in his jaw jumped. "He's threatening you." "He's scared," I corrected. "He knows that if I have a claim to the house, his little kingdom starts to crumble. He's not trying to protect his home, he's trying to protect his lie." I looked at the text again. Gary thought fear was still his currency. He thought he could bully me into silence like he had for a decade. But he didn't realize that fear evaporates when you have nothing left to lose. I didn't reply. I didn't block him. I took a screenshot. "Let him think he has the upper hand," I said, putting the phone away. "He's about to find out that threats don't work on someone who has already walked through the fire. The threat of a lawsuit from a narcissist is never about the law. It is about intimidation. Gary wasn't going to sue me. He couldn't afford to sue me. But he could definitely try to destroy my name in a town where reputation was currency. I knew Savannah. I knew how quickly whispers traveled from the church pews to the country club. If Gary started telling people I was unstable, ungrateful, or dangerous, those labels would stick long before I had a chance to peel them off. So I didn't engage. I didn't defend myself. I weaponized his own arrogance against him. Jonathan introduced me to a man named Marcus, a forensic accountant who specialized in piercing corporate veils. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like a librarian who hadn't seen the sun in a decade, but his eyes were sharp, predatory. We sat in a conference room in Jonathan's downtown office, surrounded by screens displaying the financial entrails of Gary's life. "We start with the timeline," Marcus said, his fingers flying across a keyboard. "You said Gary was broke before your mother passed?" "Destitute," I confirmed. "We were eating rice and beans 3 nights a week. He had maxed out 2 credit cards trying to keep his old truck running. He was bitter about it, constantly complaining that the world owed him better." Marcus nodded. And then she died. 6 months later, Gary bought his first fleet of 3 shipping trucks. He moved us into the Colonial in the historic district. He joined the yacht club. He told everyone he had secured a silent investor who believed in his vision. Marcus pulled up a digital map of Gary's business filings. "There is no investor," he said flatly. "I've pulled the incorporation documents for Coastal Logistics Solutions. It's a sole proprietorship that morphed into an LLC. The initial capital injection was $150,000. It came from a personal checking account, not a business loan." 150,000. The number made my blood run cold. It was the exact amount of my mother's life insurance policy. We spent the next 6 hours digging. It was grueling work, sifting through 10 years of financial deception. We found the pattern. Gary didn't just use the initial money to start the business. He used the company accounts as his personal piggy bank. There were business expenses that were clearly tuition payments for Cole's private school. There were client dinners that matched the dates of Tiffany's spa weekends. He was bleeding the company dry to maintain the illusion of wealth, terrified that if he stopped spending, people would realize he was hollow. But the most damning evidence wasn't the embezzlement. It was the timing. Marcus found a series of transfers dated 3 days after my mother's funeral. "He didn't even wait for the grass to grow," Marcus muttered. "He moved the insurance payout into a shell account, then filtered it into the business. It's classic laundering, clumsy but effective enough to fool anyone who wasn't looking." I stared at the screen. I wasn't looking at numbers anymore. I was looking at the price of my mother's life. Gary had turned her death into his startup capital. "He's vulnerable," Marcus concluded, leaning back in his chair. "He's overleveraged. He has 3 mortgages on the house, maxed out lines of credit on the business, and investors who think they're buying into a solvent company. If we pull one thread, the whole tapestry unravels." "Pull it," I said. "Pull it all." I wasn't the scared little girl hiding in her room anymore. I was the auditor of his sins, and I was about to close his account for good. The smoking gun wasn't a bank transfer. It was a PDF file, scanned and buried deep within a folder labeled Miscellaneous Assets from 10 years ago. Marcus clicked it open and the image filled the large screen in the conference room. It was a document authorizing the dissolution of the Linda Sterling Trust, the specific financial vehicle my mother had set up to hold her life insurance payout for my education. At the bottom of the page was a signature, Linda Sterling. I leaned in, my breath catching in my throat. I knew my mother's handwriting better than my own. She had a specific way of looping her L's, a graceful sweeping curve that she had practiced since grade school. The signature on the screen was jagged. It was hesitant. It looked like someone trying to draw a memory of a signature rather than writing their own name. "That's not her," I whispered. "She didn't sign that." "We know," Marcus said, his voice devoid of surprise. "Look at the date." The document was dated 3 days after her official time of death. Gary hadn't just forged her signature. He was so desperate and sloppy that he had forgotten to backdate the crime. He had legally resurrected a dead woman just long enough to rob her orphan. Jonathan stood up and walked to the window, his back rigid with a fury that vibrated through the room. "He dissolved the trust," Jonathan said, his voice tight. "He took the $150,000 that was meant to keep you safe and he called it seed capital." The realization hit me like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of my lungs. It wasn't just theft. It was an origin story. For 10 years I had listened to Gary brag about being a self-made man. At every dinner party, every country club mixer, he would puff out his chest and tell the story of how he built Coastal Logistics from nothing but grit and a dream. He looked down on everyone else as lazy. He looked down on me as a burden. But it was all a lie. He wasn't a businessman, he was a parasite. He hadn't built an empire, he had stolen one. Every truck in his fleet, every suit in his closet, every brick of that pristine colonial house I had been kicked out of, it was all paid for with my mother's life. He didn't build his kingdom on hard work, he built it on her grave. Suddenly the last 10 years made perfect sense. Gary didn't hate me just because I wasn't his biological daughter. He hated me because I was the living, breathing evidence of his fraud. Every time he looked at me he saw the debt he could never repay. He saw the crime that could send him to prison. That was why he tried to crush me. That was why he kept me small, poor, and dependent. He needed me to feel worthless so I would never think to look for what was mine. I stood up and walked to the screen, tracing the jagged line of the forged signature. "He threw me out of my own house," I said, the anger finally crystallizing into something cold and sharp. He told me he was done paying for a mistake. But he wasn't paying for anything. I was paying for him. I bought his car. I bought his reputation. I bought his life. I turned to Jonathan and Marcus. The fear I had felt leaving the house that morning was gone, replaced by a clarity so sharp it felt dangerous. He's not a CEO, I said. He's an imposter. And I'm going to make sure everyone in Savannah knows exactly who paid for his ticket to the top. The Savannah Yacht Club was a fortress of beige linen and old money, sitting on the edge of the marshes like a crown jewel nobody was allowed to touch. Inside the grand ballroom, the air conditioning was set to a brisk 68 degrees to combat the Georgia humidity, but the atmosphere was stifling for a different reason. It was the Golden Anchor anniversary dinner, the night the maritime elite gathered to pat themselves on the back for another year of hoarding wealth. And tonight the guest of honor was Gary. I watched from behind the double doors as Gary soaked in the spotlight, posing as the self-made patriarch with his award gleaming and Tiffany dabbing staged tears in the front row. Cole scrolled on his phone, wearing a suit paid for with money stolen from my mother. Gary launched into his familiar speech about grit and sacrifice, the room applauding the myth they wanted to believe. Jonathan appeared beside me, flanked by 2 federal fraud agents, and asked if I was ready. I pushed the doors open and walked down the aisle in a charcoal suit that made Gary's whole origin story look cheap. Conversations died the moment guests recognized Jonathan Sterling. Gary faltered mid-sentence, his confidence cracking. I climbed the stage and laid a copy of the trust dissolution document, signed with my dead mother's jagged forged signature, over his speech. When Gary tried to dismiss me as unstable, I adjusted the microphone and told the room exactly how he built his empire, with $150,000 stolen 3 days after her funeral. The silence was immediate and brutal. Jonathan backed me, confirming the bank records and transfers. Investors began distancing themselves in real time. Gary shouted about sacrifice and family, but the room had already turned. When he collapsed into sobs, it was clear he wasn't grieving his actions, only the loss of his audience. Moments later, federal agents escorted him away. Tiffany slipped out first, abandoning him the second the facade cracked. What followed was swift. Frozen assets, fleeing investors, a guilty plea, and the liquidation of everything he owned. The grand house sold at auction, Tiffany filed for divorce, and Gary ended up in a small rental, disgraced in the industry he once bragged he built from nothing. I received a $500,000 settlement for the theft and years of financial abuse. Jonathan asked what I'd spend it on. Instead of luxury or travel, I created the Linda Sterling Logistics Scholarship. Microgrants for foster youth and students from abusive homes who need certification fees or vocational training, the same small barrier that once kept me trapped. My revenge became reconstruction, using the wreckage Gary left behind to build something better for someone else. Kept going. I finished my degree with the money my mother meant for me and began planning an ethical logistics firm. Jonathan became my advisor, not my replacement father. For the first time, I was building my own legacy. When I drove past my old house and saw the sold sign, I felt no bitterness, only release. The weight was gone. The road ahead was mine. I didn't just expose Gary. I ended the story he stole from me and wrote my own. If you believe that real revenge is creating something untouchable, share this story, and tell me what you're building now that no one can take away from you.